little bit more of the prehistory connections to the end time prophecies. Where do you want to start with that? I know we've talked a little bit about it, but let's get into what you wanted to talk about.
So there's an interesting passage in the book of Ecclesiastics, and this is a maxim that's used in polytheism as well, but I'll use the biblical one. Ecclesiastics talks about nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. And that as you move on to that passage, it says that the understanding of this only brings sorrow and grief. So everything that's happened in the past is going to happen again. So if we had giants who had the technology provided to them from the fallen angels that were ruling this world, and the gods walked amongst us as watchers before the flood, and then that happened again after the flood with the offspring gods and more creation of giants, and if not for Babel, we would be looking at a different sort of outcome, which is why God intercedes again at Babel to allow enough time for all the names that were written in the book of life to have an opportunity through free choice to choose God or not. And so that's the only intercessions that God is going to make, is to ensure that that happens. And that also he was going to send the Messiah as the resolution to the angelic rebellion, and thus the resurrection. Because had the fallen angels, the princes, the archons, if you take that back to Greek, and the visible ones known about the resurrection, they wouldn't have had Jesus crucified. So it shows you that they don't know everything. But to understand that what happened throughout history with the beast empires that are the bloodlines of the reptilian giants, and I call them reptilian because they're the offspring of the seraphim, which means a fiery, serpent-faced, or dragon-faced, six-winged angel. These are angelic dragons. And when they created their oikotarian, they created bodies that look just like them, which is why you see so many reptilian gods in the pantheons, both with the parent gods before the flood and with the offspring gods after the flood. And both created giants, and we can get into that as well if you like a little bit later. But because they created an oikotarian, and we know they can take the physical form of any choice that they want, and or as a human if they want it as well, just as we see angels in Hebrews 13 taking angels' form, because we're told to be careful dealing with strangers lest we run across unaware an angel. So they can take a human form, we won't recognize them. They can take a human form, be recognized as an angel. And we see that as well in Genesis 18, in the Abraham story leading into the Sodom and Gomorrah, where not only does Jehovah take a form of a body, but two angels do as well. And Abraham doesn't recognize them as angels, but when the two go over to Sodom, then they're recognized by the Sodomites as angels. So the ability to take that bodily form. And there are many orders of angels. So they don't all look like humans when they take their form. So angels, we would expect as the messenger class or the warrior class in the Hebrew Saba to be with a human head, just as archangels have a human head, but other angels have different types of heads and faces. So starts to answer why you see some of the weird things in the pantheism. So when we talk about them taking a body, they're going to create DNA. So they need a body for their spirit that left heaven to interact physically in the physical world. They can be here as opalescent beings, as spirit beings, but if they want to interact physically, they need to take a physical body. When they do that, they take a body that looks like themselves, they have sex with human females, and that DNA is passed on. So if they have a serpent face, then you have a serpent offspring. If they have a lion face, as in one of the faces of a cherubim, you would have the lion men, like the Urmahulu or the lion men of Moab and Gad, and Arioch in the War of Giants, it means lion-like. And or if they had a eagle's face as another face of a cherubim, because cherubim would take one face, you would see that visual on reliefs in the Middle East with the Anunnaki, which are watchers. cherubim watchers, they're depicted with these wings doing the ceremony around this. Some people call it a tree of life, some sort of technology, some sort of tree, whatever it is. And they have eagles' heads or birds' heads and wings, and they're quite stocky. They're on both sides. And you also see the identical depiction, only with human heads. That's when they take the human form. They have a head of a human, they have a head of an eagle, they have a head of a lion, and a head of a bull. Now, here's what might also freak you out if people are into the dogmen. Anubis is a jackal god, and a jackal is one of the faces of one of the kinds of the angels. And he created offspring in great numbers. And he's equated with the god in the Bible, or part of that same type of order of angels that Nebaz, god of the Avim, giants of the east, worshipped. And Nebaz was depicted as a human with a dog head as a god. And if he had offspring, he would create dogmen as well. And they're created in multiple continents. But in Egypt, Sinopolis was the place where his offspring, Anubis's offspring, lived. Sinopolis means dog city. Sino is the root word in Greek for cynocephalus, which is about the dog mythos, or the dog Nephilim, or the dog men mythos. And that we have all kinds of different types of giants that were created by fallen angels that typically would look after the same way that the parent gods did. So when we're talking about these seraphim watchers, understand that they produced most prolifically all of the royales. And so the other giants, like the lion men or the dog men, they would be more mercenaries and warriors, and not from the ruling or the priest class.
These cryptids are just like offshoot Nephilims.
Wait up, obviously Bigfoot.
All that, do you think, by chance, Wayne?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Mary
So,
Wayne,
I mean,
wow. That's incredible.
So you actually get, like, in the Gnostic Gospel, Pistis Sophia, in Book 4, chapter 126, a pit prison or an abyss prison scene of parent gods. And this is not a Christian Bible. This is a Gnostic Gospel. And in there is one, and they're all in these specific cells. And these are the watchers or the rulers. One has a crocodile face, one has a cat's face, probably a lion's face, one has a dog's face. That one's name is Arak, as it's called. One has a bull's face, one has a boar's face or a pig, one has a bear face, which could be a procreator angel for Bigfoot, or there's also in the Hindu pantheon a monkey god and an ape god. So you could say maybe one, that's the same type of angel. One has an eagle's face, and on and on and on. All these descriptions of these things, some of them have multiple heads, just like the cherubim would have 4 heads. But these ones are in a physical body put in the prison, and it's a direct parallel to information that we have in the Bible.
So when you say OT and NT, what are we talking about? Oh,
Old Testament and New Testament.
oh, okay.
So there's a flood coming.
Yeah, and I don't know if we get this. No?
There's not a flood. No. Destruction by fire, just as it says in the age of Aquarius. So in 2 Peter 3, it says the end world is reserved for the same fire that destroyed the earth in prehistory, whenever that was, and between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, when the earth was destroyed down to its foundations in the angelic war. Last part, my speculation, when the angelic war happened, I think they had the weaponry to do it and still have. And that caused all of the waters above to collapse on the waters below.
Oh.
And then the earth was renewed in days 1 through 6, as Psalms 104 says, when God sends the Spirit, the earth is renewed. And that when humans were created on day 6, they were led astray again by the angelic rebellion. And just as the Nahash or the serpent beings were, which were created before humans in day 6, so up to 1,000 years before, and that's why you have the creation of Adam, which is completely different than the creation of the people of day 6, created for a special commission as the salvation to humankind and the resolution to the angelic rebellion, which plays through into the end time, which comes to that sort of point where we move into the new age, and all of the spirits ones, the bloodlines that have been ruling this earth, will be dealt in the end time. And, a lot of people say, well, after I wrote book 1, you said you talk about all of these bloodlines, but the Bible doesn't talk about the bloodlines. And I would suggest that that's not the case. And in fact, we get passages in the Bible. And the most clear passage you have is Psalms 21:8 through 21:11. And so it's talking about the time of God's wrath and the time of God's anger. So we have the markers for the time. And it says that their fruit he will destroy from the earth, and their seed from among the children of men. This is a separate seed line. And we get these terrible ones that are talked about, and I talk about terrible ones in book 2 in great length. That's the Hebrew word erit, I am, terrible ones as that's translated. These are the Rephaim giants after the flood. These are the bloodlines that are ruling over the beast empires, all of the royales. And the worst of these are put in the pit prison after the flood, just like Nephilim before the flood went into the pit prison. And they're put there after they've been slaughtered, killed, likely beheaded. We can get into that if you want in a few minutes. And they are there for the terrible things that they did on the earth. And that word erit is the root word for Ugarit, or the city of Og, as you take that back to its original Semitic, where Og will move to Mount Hermon to rule over the Amorites after the fall of Ugarit, or after the fall of the fall of the Rephaim in the giant wars in Genesis 14. And that's the Ug, terrible one. That's his original city. It's named after him. I go and show the detail of that in book 1. So these are the terrible ones. And in Isaiah 25, these are the branch of the terrible ones that are going to be brought low on a mountain, Mount Hermon, Armageddon, in the end time. And these are the same ones that are talked about in Daniel 2:43, which are the 10 kings which come out of the beast empires, and in this case from the Roman Empire. And this is the metallic empire prophecy, in that you have this degradation of the purebloods from gold down to iron, and then in the end time to iron and clay. And you could look at that as two different factions on two different toes. But here's the thing, and that's probably part of the allegory. Deuteronomy 2:43 says, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. There's a different race there that's going to mingle themselves with the seed of men in the end time. So that's either new Nephilim coming back, or that's the descendants, or they're possessing these descendants as demons. And you could look at that in Hebrew as getting to that meaning as possessing as well, but they're going to mingle their seed. That also says that they're going to create more either hybrid human giants or more Nephilim in the end time. And that's the same passages that are being talked about in Genesis 3:15 with the seed of the serpent, which is fulfilled in Genesis 6 with the creation of the giants from the seraphim watchers. And this is the bloodline that's talked about in the Bible that we do battle with, the visible ones that are the spurious offspring of the invisible ones. So we know there's a separate seed line, and we know that they are going to continue to rule until the end time. And we know when they're talking about these giants in the end time that we have to use Greek, which the New Testament is written in, versus Hebrew. It would be nice if it was both Hebrew. You have to find cognate words for these giants and their bloodlines. And we get that throughout the New Testament, but very, very clearly in the book of Revelation, where it talks about, the kings of the earth and the great men of the earth. And so when we're talking about the great men, that's the Greek word megas, which means not only great, but also it means great in stature, great in age, great in mass, great in height. And it's rooted in the Greek word megas and connected to megasistos, and all of those words go back to Indo-Aryan, which is the giant races. There's 4 to 5 giant races after the flood of the Indo-Aryan meg, which means large, vast, tall, big, and mighty in its etymology. The other word is megastanes, is the use that's word, and that is 3175 in the Greek lexicon for the Testament, and it means lords, nobles, and grandees. And grandees is a grandees of a kingdom, and it's from 3176 megistos, which is the source word for that, which carries some of the meanings. And grandees etymologies goes back to meaning big, lofty, majestic, old, pedigree, and genealogical. So we can make connections to the mighty ones that are used in the Joel 1 and 2 war and the Joel 3 war, which is the Armageddon war. Joel 1 and 2 is Ezekiel 38 and 39, matches up to Revelation 9 after the abyss is open, before the midpoint of the last 7 years. And also the mighty ones are the ones in the Gog war, which is the same war as Joel 1 and 2 in Revelation 9. And that means Gibor or Gibborim, which is a term used to describe the giants. And that's where you have the supper, not like Armageddon, it's like Armageddon, but this is the supper of the fatlings of Bashan, or the bulls of Bashan. Bull is a term for God in most of the polytheist cultures and or fallen angels, and for their offspring. So let's say in the Ugaritic text, or in Sumeria, where in Gilgamesh is called a bull in both, all the giants were called bulls as the spirit's offspring. So when you see the definition for giant, people say, well, it says bully. Doesn't mean giant. Well, it means a tribe of giant, it means giant, and it means a bully. That word is context, because the kings were called bullies. And so the bulls of Bashan are both the fallen angels and their offspring. And these are the ones that are surrounding Jesus on the cross and mocking him at his crucifixion. And so the other word is that they'll point to is tyrant. Well, they say, well, they're tyrants, they're not giants. Well, tyrants comes from tyrannos in Greek, and tyrannos in Anatolian or Indo-Aryan. And there were terms for these violent, horrible, giant kings called the Gyges king, or in plural, Gyes. When there's an I or an E in Greek, as opposed to other letters, it softens the G sound to a Y, which is how you get into the etymology of giant from Gyges and Gigantes, but that's a different a rabbit hole. But these Gyges kings were the bloodline of the Herculides kings from the Cretazens. Cretazens as in Crete, as where the Philistines come from, and several other kinds of giants that end up in the Middle East in the time of the Philistines. And awesome. That the Cretagens is the gens of Zeus. Zeus, with Alcmene, a human female after the flood, produced Hercules. And so these Gyges kings are some of the branches of the Herculides, as they're called in Greek history, of these demigod kings. And so they were tyrants. That's where the word comes back to. And so a lot of Hebrew writers will say that the term for the princes of the Philistines, Sarim, Hebrew, goes back in its etymology to Tyrannos or Tyrannos. And they were obviously not pureblood of the Herculides bloodline, but they're from Crete, from where Zeus had some offspring. And part of that Crete or Cretazens, where Creta comes from, is the island of Crete. And that Sarim is the word for the princes of the Philistines, and a special title for them as hybrid giants. So Philistines are hybrids because they have a genealogy back to humans in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and First Chronicles, but many interbred with the Rephaim because Rephaim had a fertility issue after the flood. So as not to go extinct, they mated with human males and females to create the hybrid. So where you have Amalek as the son of Timnah, a Horim, and Eliphaz, son of Esau, brother of Jacob, they create the Amalekite hybrid race versus the Amalekim giants that precede them, that are shown in by a couple hundred years in Genesis 14, War of Giants, just as one example. And Esau also married Aholibama, another Horim, and created another race of hybrid Edomites. And so you have a lot of these hybrids like Amorites that don't have a patriarch. You have Jebusites that don't have a patriarch. There's only 9 nations in the Table of Nations that don't have patriarchs. 9 of the Canaanite clans. They married Rephaim patriarchs. Wives or daughters, females of those races intermarried with Rephaim to produce those hybrid races. And again, I lay the whole case down for that in book 2. So I separate who the hybrid giants are to the hybrid angelic humans are that were the pureblood giants.
Are they inherently evil, would you say? And related to that, are they subject to Christ's sacrifice? You know, I mean, was that applicable to them as well? If they wanted to be saved, could they, these giants, or are they some other type of entity, like the angels, kind of?
Some people say that because they have a counterfeited spirit from the fallen angels that they're not able to be saved. I'm not really there. I think anything that you inherit innocently, you're not held accountable for. And that through free choice, and all beings have free choice, whether it's fallen angels who chose to rebel, giants who chose to stay loyal to their celestial mafia godfathers, or humans, we all have free choice. And so they have the ability to choose God or not. So I think they had a choice. Now, some people will say, but there's no way the first ones could be. Perhaps, but the only way biblically you can get there by saying that some of the originals could not be saved would be through Israelite law, where it says that the sins of the father does not carry past the third to fourth generation. So the worst case you could make for ones that could not be saved, or the best case you could make for the ones that could not be saved, biblically, would be 3 to 4 generations. And then after that, perhaps that Xeroxing of the counterfeit spirit was so impure that either the babies didn't live or they're again being sent spirits from heaven to be in those Oiketarians.
One question. You said that they're invisible. Do you mean by any chance interdimensional?
Well, both. So if you look at the invisible ones, these are typically understood as spirit beings. So these would be the fallen angels and then demons that don't have spirits of whatever form of demon. And there could be different offspring of fallen angels, like the elementals, for example. So they could be bodiless and they would be a demonic spirit as well. They would be invisible. Now, angels have interdimensional capability, just as we see angels coming from heaven. We also, in polytheism, have Baal, for example, that's used in the Bible for the Canaanite pantheon as the offspring of El before the flood. Baal would go back and forth through the gate of Hades at Mount Hermon every day to inspect all of his empires, so to speak. And so he would travel in another dimension. So Sheol, Hades, Argatha, Otherworld, Anwin, the 1,000 names that this location is called in languages and religions around the world, is in the earth, but in another dimension. So there's portals that would go back and forth. I would think angels could create their own portals, but demigods could not. And demigods are, by definition, the offspring of gods, and human males or human females. And so the giants, as in the Ugaritic texts, they would go, and these are from the tribe of the Datanu. This is the tribe of the Rapiu, or RPM, which is original vowel Semitic for Rephaim in Hebrew. Hebrew is a Semitic language. Had the ability to go back in between dimensions. So they would do it at certain times of rituals. And if one of the giants died, they would want to parade them through these portals into the other world where their gods are ruling from. Right? So, and the Rephaim, they are the ones who are talked about most after the flood. And the Ugaritic text matches up so well with the original Hebrew that you can use those words and get a better understanding. So in the Ugaritic text, they say the Rapiu, the Rapiyum, or the RPM in Vala Semitic. They would say that these were healer kings or priest kings, and they only do part of the meaning. So the root word for Rephaim, and the H is an evolution into the word, into Hebrew after the P, just as Nephilim used to be Naphalim and original NPL, you would have Raphaim as original without the H, and RPL or RPM as the original root word for it. So the Rephaim root word is 7495, which means healer, which is really important because, and I'll come back to that, because of what capabilities these giants had. And one presumes the Nephilim before the flood were larger, even had more powers. The next word is 7496, which is for the sheds or the evil spirits or the demonic spirits associated with death. So it is a derivative of 7495. 7497 is the word for giant and a tribe of giants, which is used 25 times in the Old Testament after the flood. So the most dominant name. In fact, Nephilim as actual beings outside of the evil report, which is, I think, an embellishment of the Anakim, which are called giants, which are Rephaim. If you take that back to Hebrew and Deuteronomy 2, Nephilim don't show up after the flood except for there biblically, and that's using that as an exaggeration to drive fear into the Israelites so they don't go into the covenant land. So when we look at 7497, that's the word giant. 7496 is the demonic spirit of the giants, the disembodied spirits after the body dies, because their life was limited to 120 years in Genesis 6:3. And so that they wouldn't be gods in this physical world where the bodies lasted forever along with the counterfeit spirit. And so 7495 is the root word heal. And it's important because they could heal others in the Ugaritic texts and themselves. And they were very hard to kill, which is why you had to take their heads off. You had to decapitate them so that they wouldn't have an opportunity to repair themselves, which in the ancient world and in the execration text of Egypt and elsewhere explains that's the most worst death for a royale, a bloodline giant, because they can't go where they want to go. They probably end up going to the pit prison or wandering the earth, but they don't get to the other world where their gods are. And so I go through decapitation and all the ancient accounts of it and how we know that the giants can heal themselves and why the Rephaim and that word is so important. And also in the word terrible ones, one of the definitions, there's all these words that define them as giants, but they're also had an infertility issue and were childless. So after the flood, it's not that they can't produce in great numbers, they can't produce enough women, which is why you have to have them marry, as you have Timnah and Aholibama marrying Esau and Eliphaz, and why Rephaim are taking human women to create hybrids so that the race doesn't go extinct. Whereas the Nephilim before the flood could multiply in great numbers and had no issues in that. And so there's a distinction between the Rephaim and the Nephilim, and I think one's before the flood and one is after the flood. And so these terrible ones could heal themselves, and that's why when they're killed, they have their heads cut off in Ezekiel 32, where we get this incredible dual prophecy with these terrible ones in Ezekiel 32. And it's just a mind-blowing passage. I also cover that in detail in book 2.
This is so
He
complex.
really didn't talk.
Okay, go
Yeah,
on.
it is. So what I do in book 2 for people is I can identify biblically who all the giant races are and who the hybrid races are. And you can get at the original patriarch through using patrial names. Typically, cities were named after these giants, mountains were named after them, locations were named after them, and patronymically, as in a bloodline or titles that are going down, and etymologically as well. And so I trace all of the giant nations back to a specific patriarch, and I trace the hybrid nations back to a specific patriarch in book 2 as well. So, as I said, you don't have in the table of nations Rapha listed for the Rephaim, and the Rephaim tribe is shown in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants, and then again in Genesis 15 in the land that's occupied by the mighty 7 and the mighty 10 that is being promised to Abraham. We don't get Rapha as a name in the Table of Nations, and that's the patriarch for the Rephaim. Probably goes back to Baal, because Baal and Anat create the Rephaim after the flood, and that's why they're doing fertility rituals in the Ugaritic text to bring Baal and Anat back, because they don't want to go extinct. But Baal and Anat did the same thing as the parent gods, as El and Ashtaroth did before the flood. They created giants, and they went to the pit prison. Immediately after the flood, Baal, Anat, and the Baalim create giants after the flood again. I do leave open that some Nephilim can survive, but biblically it fits much better for a second incursion, and biblically through Baal and Anat and the Baalim create these giants, and they've disappeared as well. Somewhere probably around time of Babel or shortly after, because they did the same crimes as their parents. They go to the pit prison. And so another giant that we get as the patriarch identified biblically, who's not in the Table of Nations, is Arba. And in the book of Joshua, not only is Arba the greatest of the Anakim giants, Hebrew Rapha, plural Rephaim, Arba is the patriarch of the giants in the book of Joshua has his name. He doesn't show up in the Table of Nations. Now, the Horim, as I mentioned, is also in Deuteronomy 2, as opposed to the Horites, which would be hybrids. Horim are giants. Again, goes back to the Hebrew word Rapha, not Nephilim. So these are post-diluvian giants. Horim has 3 different branches. People probably familiar with the Hurrians. That's one of the branches of the Horim, but a different patriarch within that branch. It just says the Hivim are thought to be Horim, but they're a different branch too. And there's one Hivim that's talked about in Genesis 36 with these dukes of Edom, where the Esau and Timnah and Eliphaz and intermarriages are talked about in the creation of the Amalekites. But the Hivim are mostly in the central region. And so that would be Hivi, as it shows up in Hebrew in the singular, and a patriarchal and a patronymic and a patrial name of locations. Horim, it would be Hori as the patriarch, and Huri for the Hurrians. And we get this name called Horam, King Horam of Gezer, for example, just to give an example of what I'm talking about. 2 Hebrew words are put together there. Hori, or Hori, as in the original patriarch, and Am, meaning people or father. You could translate that either way. And so this is the people of Hori that he's the king of, or he's the father, his father is Hori. Or maybe his father was Hori. You could translate it any way that you want. So that's how I go about arriving at the original name. So like the Amorites would be going back to a patriarch of a giant called Amaru, as opposed to a god also by the name Amaru. In the Ugaritic text, you get Amar and Amaru as a god of the Baalim, and also giants that are called Amur as well. And we see that show up in the Hebrew as Emori, and Hamor connected to Amor as another transliteration of that. And King Hamor is of the Hivim, a king of some of the Hivim of a later period. And so I'll just go through some of the names that people may not recognize